By the time the teller said his account was frozen, the whole branch had already gone quiet. Walter Boone stood at window 3 in his work jacket, one hand on the brass rail, waiting to withdraw the last $8 in his passbook account. Enough for gas, maybe coffee, maybe the blood pressure prescription. He was stretching 2 days too long. The teller glanced at the screen, then toward the assistant manager, a young man in a navy tie who came over smiling the way people do when they think policy will protect them. He said the account was under review. He said Walter would need to come back next week. Then, lower but not low enough, he said, "It's only $8, sir." Walter didn't raise his voice. He only asked for the printed notice. The chapter opens inside a modest regional branch just after lunch, with fluorescent lights humming and a coffee ring drying beside a stack of deposit slips. Walter Boone has spent most of his life repairing irrigation pumps, grain augers, and truck starters for people who pay late, but eventually pay. He isn't dramatic, and that is precisely why the humiliation lands so hard. He asks for $8 from the old passbook account he has kept open since his wife was alive. Not a loan, not an overdraft, just his own money. The teller hesitates, calls over the assistant manager, and the conversation becomes public in the way small town humiliations always do. The young manager does not call Walter dishonest. He does something worse. He talks around him, about him, in procedural language. Restricted status, legacy hold, review queue. Then, when Walter asks what triggered it, the young man shrugs and says the account is too old to verify quickly. A woman in line turns away to spare him embarrassment. Another customer pretends not to listen. Walter folds the printed freeze notice once, precisely. No argument. No plea. Just one sentence. "You might want to make me a copy of everything tied to that account." The manager refuses, politely. At home, Walter sets the notice beside a chipped enamel mug and writes the date and time in a small black notebook he has used for years. His daughter, Claire, notices he also adds the branch window number. That detail feels strange. So does the line he writes under it, "They said legacy hold," out loud. The chapter ends with Claire asking softly, "Dad, why does that matter?" And Walter answering, "Because that language is older than the boy who used it." Claire does not begin with outrage. She begins with paper. The next morning, she drives to her father's house before work, where the kettle is already on, and the freeze notice is laid flat under a salt shaker, so it won't curl. Walter brings out an old vinyl bank pouch from a kitchen drawer. Inside are passbooks, carbon copy deposit receipts, 2 money order stubs, and a folded yellow sheet with the original account number typed in a format the modern bank no longer uses. Claire notices one handwritten code repeated beside several entries: LH 71. She spends the afternoon at the county library where deed books, merger notices, and local newspaper microfilm are kept in a back room that smells like dust and radiator heat. The current bank, she learns, absorbed Walter's original savings association decades ago. The acquisition had been small, local, and mostly forgotten. A librarian remembers that part of the old branch archive was donated after the demolition of the downtown annex. The boxes were never fully sorted. In a filing cabinet drawer labeled Miscellaneous Rural Accounts, Claire finds a gray cloth ledger with cracked corners and a pasted spine tag dated 1971. It is handwritten, meticulous, and not meant for public display. Several account numbers are marked with red pencil notes. Walter's account is one of them. Beside it, legacy hold harmless, no service charges, offset prohibited, assumed under merger schedule A. Claire reads the line twice, then a third time. At the bottom of the page is a cross, reference to board minutes, and a vault file that should have followed the account into the bank's modern system. The chapter ends on the smallest, most chilling detail of all. Someone, years later, tried to erase the notation with a pale pink correction fluid that never fully covered the ink. Claire does not march into the bank with the ledger. She and Walter do what quiet people do when they know noise helps the other side. They make copies. They label folders. They sit at the kitchen table under the slow tick of the wall clock while coffee cools untouched. Walter brings out 40 years of ordinary paper, the way other men might bring out tools renewal slips, Christmas club receipts, address change cards, a notice from the 1980s confirming the account's grandfathered status, and a stack of monthly statements his late wife kept clipped with grocery coupons. Claire builds a binder in sections: branch interaction, account history, predecessor institution, merger language, potential damages. She highlights 3 phrases from the gray ledger, and then spends 2 evenings at the library pulling old regulatory notices and local legal advertisements from microfilm. A retired teller, now living outside town, agrees to speak only after Claire promises she is not calling a reporter. Over tea in her sunroom, the woman confirms that some legacy rural accounts carried special restrictions after the merger, and that corporate never liked those files. The first real reveal arrives in a dusty county records room, where Claire finds the merger schedule indexed as an attachment to a charter amendment. Schedule A lists a category of assumed accounts, protected from service charges and internal set-off, because they were tied to settlement funds and estate reserves from a predecessor institution. Walter's account number is there, handwritten in the margin. Suddenly the freeze is not a clerical mistake. It is either negligence buried across decades or a software conversion that wiped legal protections from living accounts. Walter says very little. He just turns a page in his notebook and writes. They knew enough to rename it. The chapter ends with Claire preparing a preservation letter instead of a complaint, because she understands something before the bank does. Once they know the file exists, they may start looking for ways to explain it away. Claire sends 3 things by certified mail: a demand for the complete account file, a preservation notice covering merger documents and digital migration records, and a copy of the 1971 ledger page with the correction, fluid mark visible. She sends 1 set to the branch, 1 to regional counsel, and 1 to the state banking department's consumer division. Then they wait. The first response comes too fast for a bank that had needed a week to release $8. The branch manager calls before noon, suddenly eager, suddenly respectful. He says the restriction was probably automated. He says they can release the funds immediately. He says he'd be happy to clear up the misunderstanding. Walter thanks him and asks for the file in writing. By the second day, someone from regional compliance offers a written apology and a courtesy payment. Not much, but enough to reveal the bank no longer sees this as a customer service complaint. Claire declines. She asks instead for the legacy conversion table, used when old account codes were migrated into the current system. The woman on the phone goes quiet for a full second too long. Then the bank makes its first real mistake. In a letter marked confidential, counsel describes Walter's account as one of a small number of inherited exception status passbook accounts. That phrase is an admission. Small number means known category. Known category means somebody knew these protections existed. Walter reads the line twice, then places the letter beside the original freeze notice on the table, as if arranging evidence for a stranger. The emotional beat is small but sharp. This is the first time Claire sees something like hurt cross his face, not because of the money, but because it confirms what he suspected in the branch. He was not ignored by accident. He was inconvenienced by a system that assumed men like him would never ask what the code meant. The chapter ends when a second offer arrives, this time with a number large enough to feel strange and a confidentiality clause folded inside. What changes the case is not outrage. It is pattern. Claire starts comparing names from the merger schedule against obituary notices, probate filings, and fragments of passbook records preserved in county estate packets. She identifies several other legacy accounts that likely should have retained protected status. Some belong to widows. One appears to have been tied to an estate reserve. Another belonged to a veteran whose grandson remembers unexplained maintenance deductions after the bank changed systems years earlier. The State Consumer Division acknowledges receipt. A quiet examiner asks for copies of the ledger, the merger schedule, and the bank's letters. Claire sends everything in a legal folder with tabs. 2 days later, the bank's outside counsel requests a call, then another, then a meeting in person. At the meeting, held in a conference room with bad coffee and a glass bowl of wrapped mints, The bank tries a new tonesy sympathetic, professional, tired. They say the account coding may have been lost during a core platform migration. They say there is no evidence of intentional misconduct. They say they are prepared to make Walter whole. Claire slides a page across the table listing restitution categories, file production demands, and preservation of audit trails. She also includes potential claims breach of assumed account terms, wrongful restriction of protected funds, unfair practices, and spoliation concerns tied to altered records. That is when the third offer comes, and it is no longer insulting. It includes attorney fees and asks for silence. Walter listens to the figures without changing expression. Then he notices something on the production index. They hand it over by mistake, an internal review memo titled Legacy Exception Exposure. He does not point to it immediately. He lets the silence do the work. The chapter ends with a late night call from compliance, not counsel, asking if this can still be resolved, informally, which tells Claire the panic has moved above the branch and below the boardroom, the exact place where institutions make desperate decisions. The ending is not a courtroom monologue. It is paperwork, deadlines, corrections, and the slow sound of a corporation trying to close a door after smoke has already drifted into the hall. Faced with the ledger, the merger schedule, the altered notation, the pattern across other legacy accounts, and regulatory attention it cannot neatly manage, the bank chooses settlement before public litigation widens discovery. The final agreement is structured, careful, and expensive in all the ways banks hate most: restitution to affected account holders, reversal of improper fees, independent review of converted legacy accounts, attorney fees, and a written acknowledgement that certain assumption terms were not honored after system migration. Walter's individual payment is meaningful, but not theatrical. Claire's greatest satisfaction is quieter than money. The agreement forces the bank to correct the records and notify other customers whose protections may have been stripped. No one at the branch says they laughed at him. No one says they were wrong in those words. Institutions rarely do, but the documents do it for them. On the morning Walter's account is restored, he goes back to the same branch in the same jacket. Window 3 is empty. A different teller helps him. She is careful with her tone. He withdraws $8 in cash and asks for a printed balance. Then he folds the receipt and places it inside the black notebook beside the original freeze notice. Outside, he and Claire stand a moment in the parking lot while the wind moves through the flag by the drive-through. She asks whether he feels better. Walter looks at the bank, then at the receipt in his hand. It wasn't the 8, he says. It was whether they thought nobody would remember. The story closes at his kitchen table. The tea kettle clicks off. Claire slides the 1971 ledger into an archival sleeve. Walter writes one final line in the notebook. They remembered after we showed them how.